Welcome to Reading the Gospels Together for Saturday, May the 2nd. And today we're reading Mark chapter 9. But as we have focused on the Transfiguration in our Matthew study earlier, we're going to spend all of our time this morning on the healing at the center of this chapter, Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 29. Now, to set the scene, Jesus, along with Peter, James, and John, have now come down from the Mount of Transfiguration and the revelation of Jesus in his glory and the visitation by Moses and Elijah. But instead of returning to the others in triumph, they enter a scene of chaos. Listen, it says, "When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. 'What are you arguing with them about?' he asked." Now, the first thing this made me think of is the scene from Exodus, or from the Ten Commandments movie with Charlton Heston, of Moses coming down from the mountain from the presence of God, only to be greeted by the sight of the people worshiping a golden calf. Mountaintop experiences don't often survive exposure to the problems of our world. Our spiritual lives are filled with such hills and valleys. I'll never forget talking with a woman I bumped into in a grocery store on a Monday morning. "That was such a wonderful church service," she said yesterday. "I felt like my feet would never touch the ground. Then I had an argument in the car on the way home with my husband about the kids and spent the rest of the day depressed. I think I need church every day." Now, unfortunately, we don't have church every day, especially nowadays. Well, that's where faith comes in. It sustains us between our times of worship, our times in the presence of God. It brings us through the valleys. Now, the second thing I notice in our story today is that the disciples are arguing. There's a man with a profound need. He's got a desperately stricken son. And the disciples are busy arguing. It's small wonder they weren't able to help the man and his son. Now, in the life of the church, we relive this story time and again. The church spends far too much time arguing and far too little time extending hope and healing to those in need. Our own denomination has been caught up in an extended argument for years now, putting all kinds of energy into the dispute, while many congregations struggle just to stay open. Church is a place for faith and for prayer and for keeping our focus on Jesus, and that's hard to do while you're arguing. Notice that it says, as soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and they ran to greet him. That's what people come to church for, to encounter Jesus, not to get into an argument. We need to remember that. The man finally gets to speak to Jesus, and he describes his son's affliction. Interestingly, when Luke, a physician, describes the scene, he uses the medical term convulsions. To our modern eyes, as to Luke, it appears the boy is stricken with epilepsy. In any case, the father says, "I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." Well, not by arguing they can't. But why couldn't they? We read earlier in Mark that the disciples have some success with this kind of thing. Why can't they now? Well, the clue is at the end of the passage. It says, after the healing had taken place, after Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" He replied, "This kind can only come out by prayer." You see, the disciples were trying to do this on their own. Why couldn't we drive it out? Not, why couldn't God drive it out? That's really important. We know this is the case because Jesus responds, "This kind can only come out by prayer," meaning it is by directing the problem to God and appealing to God for help, which is what prayer is, that you're not relying upon your own power and faith, but upon God to help you and to help the ones in need. And now we understand the main lesson of this passage. You see, Jesus, speaking to the Father, says, "Everything is possible for one who believes." And immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." And that's enough for Jesus to work with. You see, the man brought the problem to Jesus. His faith is imperfect, but he knows where to go for help. And that was enough. And that's what prayer is, knowing where to go for help, for faith, for strength and courage and hope. Prayer is focusing our attention upon God. Our lives are filled with all kinds of clamor, with so many things crowding into our attention and crowding God out. Prayer is finding Jesus in the crowd. Daily prayer is keeping our focus there. If you haven't been taking advantage of our daily readings and prayers, I encourage you to do so. It only takes a few moments, but it sets your feet on the right path as you start your day. And if you find praying a difficult thing to do, a good place to start would be to focus your mind for a moment on Jesus and say the same prayer which changed the life of this man and his son. I believe, help my unbelief. Now, just a parting observation before we go. Did you notice this part of the story? It says, when Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. He did not want to subject the boy to being the object of a spectacle. Now, this happens time and again in Mark. In chapter 8, when Jesus is healing a blind man, we read, he took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. Then he healed him. In chapter 7, when healing a deaf and mute man, Jesus heals him, we read, after he took him aside away from the crowd. See, healing for Jesus is not a spectacle. It's an act of compassion. Now, Monday, we'll be reading chapter 10, and we'll be paying special attention to verses 17 to 31, the rich and the kingdom of God. Don't miss the Sunday service tomorrow, and be sure to follow along with the daily readings and prayers every day. And we'll see you then.